Hi guys, welcome back to our session for today. We're going to continue talking about some commonly asked micro and macroeconomic questions. I'm going to go over these questions, kind of give you a rundown on solutions, and then we're going to look over also the answer choices that previous tutors have done and kind of amend those answers if there's anything we see wrong with them. I have not taken a look very in depth about these answers. I just picked some of the questions that we're going to be talking about today. So I'll be doing this right alongside with you guys. Okay. So with that being said, let's just jump right in. So the first question says, which best describes how the government enables government monopolies to exist? One, by issuing a patent to a producer or supplier. Two, by creating and operating a monopoly. Three, by granting an exclusive privilege to a private entity to be the sole provider of the good or service. Four, by taking control of the means of production. So this is a pretty definition-based question, not really a calculation question or anything like that. What we're looking at here is two key things. First is monopoly, right? What is a monopoly? And we know that a monopoly is when there's only one producer in the market. And the second important thing to note from the question stem is that we're talking about specifically government monopolies. So monopolies that are kind of run by the government, and that's opposed to some things that are better mentioned some of the other answer choices here. So we can go down the line. One says by issuing a patent to a producer or supplier. And what a patent is it is essentially a monopoly, but it is not a government monopoly in that a patent does not mean that the government now owns or runs the production of whatever good the patent is issued for. Rather, that the government is granting a patent. When they grant a patent, what they're essentially doing is they're granting a monopoly, a temporary monopoly, to a producer or supplier that invented the invention. And so is a government enforced monopoly, but not a government run monopoly. Two says by creating and operating a monopoly, and this is going to be probably the best choice for this question, and that's just because when we're talking about monopolies and we're talking about government, the straightforward answer is that governments are just going to create and operate a monopoly in the industry of their choice. We can take a look at some of the other answers. Three says by granting an exclusive privilege to a private entity to be the sole provider of the good or service. And while, again, this is going to be a government-granted monopoly, it is not a government-run monopoly. And so, again, that's not going to be the right answer here. And finally, four, by taking control of the means of production. And so that doesn't really grant a monopoly to anybody. And so that's not going to be the right answer here. So B is going to be the best answer, or two is going to be the best answer, by creating and operating a monopoly. So let's take a look at the previous tutor's answers. So the previous tutor said that two as well, by creating and operating a monopoly. And they say that a state monopoly is created when a government agency or corporation monopolizes a particular economic sector and prohibits entry of other firms in the same industry by law. It is a form of coercive monopoly created and operated by the government and is different from a government-granted monopoly. A government-granted monopoly, on the other hand, is created when the state allows a private individual to be the sole provider in the market and prevents the same from the competition. Natural monopolies are created either due to economies of scale or due to huge barriers to entry, and private monopolies are created from the issuance of patents. Right, so this is kind of a good definition, breaks down the difference between government or a state monopoly and a government-granted monopoly, and also kind of talks a little bit about situations in which you might see monopolies happening, like natural and private monopolies. So this is a great answer. I don't think there's anything wrong with this one. So we'll move on to the next question then. So the next question says, the Federal Reserve uses two definitions of the money supply, M1 and M2, because A, M2 satisfies the medium of exchange function of money, whereas M1 satisfies the store of value function. B, M2 is a narrow definition focused more on liquidity, whereas M1 is a broader definition of the money supply. And C, M1 is a narrow definition focused more on liquidity, whereas M2 is a broader definition of the money supply. So what we're really being asked for here is what are the definitions of M1 and M2, and how are they distinguished? So first thing we have to know is which one's broader, right? And so the answer to that is M2. M1 is a more narrow definition of the money supply, and then M2 encompasses all the types of money that are included in M1 and more, right? So if you can think about, like if you think about, if we could draw this out, let's see if I can turn this on, right? So if we draw this out and we write this as, okay, 1 second. So if this is M2, maybe like this much would be considered M1, and then M2 would be the whole chunk, right? And so this is our two definitions of money supply. We obviously that M1 is narrower. And the question becomes, what is the definition of M1, and what kinds of money are included in these two different definitions? And the answer to that is M1 includes things like cash, checking accounts, things that are basically money that is very liquid, money that you can quickly access and use. Whereas M2 is going to include all the M1 types of money and also include more long-term, harder to reach, less liquid types of money, such as savings accounts or certificates of deposits and stuff like that, right? So that's going to be the major difference between the two. So looking at the answer choices, if we know that M1 is more liquid, whereas M2 includes a range of liquid types of money, then we're looking at answer choice C being the best answer here, right? M1 is a narrow definition focused more on liquidity, whereas M2 is a broader definition of the money supply. So that's going to be our best answer there. And so let's take a look at the answer choice that the previous tutor gave. So our previous tutor says, in economics, the money supply is a concept which is widely used in macroeconomics that depicts a total flow of money and other instruments in the economy at a particular point in time. The money supply is mainly divided into four general types known as M0, M1, M2, and M3, which are divided on the base of liquidity of the instruments in each category. The categorization is in a way that the instruments present in M0 are more liquid than the M1, and M1 is more liquid than M2. So we can say that option C is the correct option. So that's a good answer. I think, there's nothing specifically wrong with that. M1, maybe we'll know that M1 and M2 are the most commonly noted definitions of money supply, since those are the two that the Federal Reserve use. So M1 and M2 are the two common definitions of the money supply. So be sure to know those two well in particular. As noted in the answer to this question, M1 includes liquid forms of money, whereas M2 encompasses all of M1 and other less liquid types of money. And yeah, so otherwise the solution is correct. We're just a little bit of clarification, but we're pretty happy with what this previous tutor has written. So let's look at this next question. A monopolist is able to maximize its profit by A, setting the price at the level that will maximize its per unit profit, B, producing output where marginal revenue equals marginal cost and charging a price along the demand curve, C, setting output at marginal revenue equals to marginal cost and setting a price at the demand curve's highest point, D, producing maximum output where price equal to marginal cost. So this is a very standard monopoly question. In terms of profit maximization, the best way to explain this is going to be by looking at the graph. So what we have here is we have the monopolist graph. So we have the typical demand curve, right, downward sloping, and then the monopolist also faces a slightly more steep marginal revenue curve. And then we can assume, constant marginal costs maybe. And the question is, where does the monopolist produce? So in this case, the profit maximizing rule for the monopolist is marginal revenue equals to marginal cost. So that's right here. And so the quantity that they produce is set by this intersection of marginal revenue and marginal costs, right? So that's Q1. instead of charging a price equal to marginal cost, because there's a higher demand curve, what the monopolist actually is going to do is they're going to continue this quantity upward and see where it intersects the demand curve, and this is going to be the price that the monopolist charges, right? So that's going to be P1, and we can see that that is higher than P star, which would have been the intersection of marginal cost and demand, where a perfectly competitive market at equilibrium would be. So P1 is going to be a little bit higher, and that's going to be, yes, inefficient, but it allows the monopolists to earn a certain level of profit, right? So it's charging P1, its marginal cost is P star, so this chunk right here is monopolist profit, right? So what we see here is that the first step is to find the intersection of marginal revenue equals to marginal cost, because that's the profit maximizing rule for monopolists, and then that you see in where monopolists would price by going to the demand curve after finding that intersection. So the best answer here, looking at the answer choices, is going to be B, right? A monopolist is able to maximize its profits by producing output where marginal revenue equals marginal cost and charging a price along the demand curve. Let's take a look at the previous tutor's answer. The previous tutor said, monopoly is a market structure in which only single seller operates and has full control over quantity supplied. There are no close substitutes for the goods sold on the market by monopolists, therefore there are barriers to market entry and exit. The profit maximizing condition for a monopolist is that a monopolist should produce where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue. This equality between marginal revenue and marginal cost results in the output at the equilibrium. The monopoly sets the price along the demand curve corresponding to the equilibrium output. Hence, the correct option is B. So I don't like how the previous tutor used the word equilibrium, because that typically points to a perfect competition scenario where we're producing at this P star price rather than this P1 price. So why don't we just amend that really quickly? So the intersection of MR, marginal revenue, and marginal cost results in a profit maximizing point for monopolists, but not competitive equilibrium. Otherwise, good answer. Look up monopoly graph for a graphical cue. Yeah, so I think this is a pretty good answer on everything else considered. The best way to think about these types of questions is to simply just think about the graph and think about what's going on there. So if we have this graph, if we know this graph is what's going on for monopolies, then it's pretty easy to pick between these points for which of these points is the profit maximizing point. So we'll mark that correct, and we can move on to the next question. So we're going back to this definition of money. This question says, which of the following is not included in M1? So if we recall back to our previous definition, M1 is going to be one of those narrow definitions of money focused on very liquid forms of money. So let's take a look at the answer choices. First is currency and coins. Second is savings deposits. 3 is traveler's checks. And 4 is demand deposits. And we're looking for which one of these is not that very liquid. And so the answer for that is going to be 2 savings deposits. And the reason for that is because there are typically restrictions on how much you can withdraw from the savings deposits and how often. And so that is not money that people are able to access right away, whereas currency, traveler's checks, demand deposits, those things are immediately accessible to people who are looking to buy something or cash something in, right? So savings deposit is going to be the one that's least liquid and not included in M1. And so this is something that is definitely noted by the Fed, that the Fed says, savings deposits is not considered a part of M1, but even if we did not know exactly which types of currency are put or categorized in M1 versus M2, given this question, all we would have to say is which one of these is the least liquid out of this list, because the least liquid one is the most likely to be not included in M1. And so savings deposits would still be the answer here. So let's take a look at the previous tutor's answer. So the previous tutor said savings deposit as well. And they said the portion of the money supply, which includes the most liquid forms of money, is known as M1, and it comprises of currency and coins, demand deposits held by depositors in the banks, checkable deposits, and traveler's checks. It consists of assets which can be used directly for market transactions or can be easily converted to cash. Other forms of money, which are not as liquid, can be classified as near money and come under M2 and M3. It's a good answer. Covers kind of the distinction between M1 and the other forms of definitions of money. And so we're to say a good answer. Let's take a look at this next question. Which of the following is the distinguishing feature of laissez-faire capitalism? A. Minimal government intervention. B. Public ownership of all capital. C. Central planning. Or D. Circular flow of goods, resources, and money. And so this is, again, a very definition-based question, not something that you're going to be able to just, memorize. Not something you're going to be able to calculate. This is just something you're going to have to memorize. So laissez-faire is a French term, I believe, and it is a form of capitalism or theory in which laissez-faire literally translates into let it be, I think. And so it refers to a theory where government should basically be hands-off in the economy, and the market will naturally kind of reach a equilibrium outside of the government's intervention. And so with that kind of definition or theory in mind, the best answer choice here would be A, minimal government intervention. If you, again, literally translate laissez-faire, that's what it would refer to. And so that would be the answer choice we would pick. Let's take a look at the previous tutor's answers. So the previous tutor said, in economics, there are various types of economic systems like socialism, the traditional economy, capitalism, etc. But the most commonly used market system is socialism and capitalism. Capitalism is the market economy where ownership is in the hands of the private sector. Capitalism is further classified as welfare, state, and laissez-faire or free market capitalism, where laissez-faire capitalism is that type of capitalism in which government intervention is absent. Therefore, option A is the correct option. Right? I mean, there's not much to explain here. This is just a definition thing, so I think this explanation does the job. Let's take a look at this next question then. Question says, when quantity supplied increases at every possible price, we know that the supply curve has A, shifted to the left, B, shifted to the right, C, shifted, rather we have not shifted, rather we have moved along the supply curve to a new point on the same, or D, not shifted, rather the supply curve has become flatter. Excuse me. So let's just draw this out really quickly. You don't have to, but it might be easier to visualize. So we have a supply curve. What we're saying is that at every possible price, quantity supply increases at every possible price, right? So let's just draw a line. So let's say at this point we have quantity supplied of Q1, and what we're saying is that actually at the exact same price of P1, we have now, instead of Q1, we produce Q2, right? We'll draw one more point. So let's say up here, let's say P2. At this price level, we used to produce Q, so we'll call this 3, Q3. And now because quantity supplied increases at every possible price, even at P3 holding the price constant, we actually produce Q4 now. So we can draw a line connecting these two, and what we're seeing is a rightward shift in the supply curve, right? At every single price, quantity supplied is increased. And so holding price constant, we would be increasing quantity supplied across the line. And so the answer to this question would be a rightward shift in the supply curve, or shift to the right? So when quantity supplied increases at every possible price, we know that the supply curve has shifted to the right, and we can see that happening on the graph here as well. Let's take a look at the previous tutor's answer. They said it has been provided that quantity supplied at every possible price is increasing. In other words, prices are remaining the same, but corresponding quantity supplied is showing an increase. Great. When the price of a commodity remains the same but supply increases, then such phenomena is called an increase in supply. It is said to have occurred due to changes in factors other than the own price of the commodity. For example, a decrease in the price of inputs, decrease in taxes, etc. An increase in supply leads to a rightward shift of the supply curve, so the supply curve has shifted to the right. Great answer. Nothing wrong with that. Looks like they hit the nail on the head with this one. And really just, that's all you really have to know for this question, and why you would have this rightward shift. And it's good for them to distinguish this type of shift from a increase in quantity supplied. So an increase in supply is a shift of the curve, but an increase in quantity supplied would be a shift along the curve, which would be answer choice C. So that's a good distinction for them to draw. So the next question says, which of the following would help the government reduce an inflationary output gap? 1 says raise the tax rate and increase government spending. 2 says reduce the tax rate and decrease government spending. 3 says raise the tax rate and decrease government spending. And 4 says reduce the tax rate and increase government spending. So 2 things to note here. First, what is an inflationary output gap? And second, all of these answer choices are talking about fiscal policy, right? So let's start with that first question, which is what is an inflationary output gap? So this is going to be a dynamic aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. And so let's draw that out. We have let's start with our long run aggregate supply, which is just a straight line, right? And then we have a short run aggregate supply. And an inflationary output gap is saying that the intersection of short run aggregate supply and the aggregate demand curve is to the right of the long run aggregate supply curve. So it's something like this, right? And so we have current production in the short run is at Q1, whereas long-term production would be a long run aggregate supply. So this gap, that's our inflationary output gap, right? So the question is, what can we do in this scenario? And so all the answer choices are talking about fiscal policy. So the idea is we know we want, if we're talking about fiscal policy, we're talking about a shift of the aggregate demand curve, right? And so we know that we want to end up back at this point where aggregate demand still intersects a short-run aggregate supply, but it intersects on the long-run aggregate supply curve, right? How do we get this leftward shift in the aggregate demand curve? And so we're essentially, if we're talking about a leftward shift in aggregate demand, we want to shrink spending, right? And so for government spending, that means a reduction in government spending, right? And so we want to talk about just decreasing the amount of spending that people are doing in order to, reducing the amount of spending that government is doing in order to bring back the total amount of spending happening in the economy. And the second thing we want to do is most likely raise taxes, right? And so if you raise taxes, you take money away from people, and you decrease disposable income, and that's going to decrease consumption spending in the economy overall as well. So that's also going to shrink the aggregate demand curve. So if we're talking about raising the tax rate and decreasing spending, that's going to be answer choice 3. And so let's take a look at the answer choice that the previous tutor wrote. So they chose answer choice 2, reduce the tax rate and decrease government spending. And so let's take a look at his rationale, right? And so they said that an inflationary output gap is created when the actual GDP of an economy exceeds its full employment GDP. As the aggregate demand curve shifts to the right on the long-run aggregate supply curve, the price level increases with a comparatively less or zero increase in the output in the economy. Okay, you know what we've done here? We've flipped aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply. So let me redraw this and make sure that I'm giving you the right information here. That was a silly mistake. So let's redraw a long-run aggregate supply curve. Oops. And so we have, this is aggregate demand, not aggregate supply, and this is short-run aggregate supply. So we still want to have a leftward shift in aggregate demand, right? AD 2 is over here, so we still want this leftward shift, but the direction of will be slightly different. So let's again, the answer choice would still be the same for shifting aggregate demand to the left. We still want to either raise taxes or decrease government spending, but the rationale for this tutor at least might make a little bit more sense. So an inflation output gap is created when the actual GDP of an economy, which is right here, is exceeding its full employment GDP, which is that long-run aggregate supply. The price, as the aggregate demand curve shifts to the right on the long-run aggregate supply curve, the price level increases with a comparatively less or zero increase in the output, causing inflation in the economy. To discourage aggregate demand, the government can either raise the tax rate or reduce government expenditure, which slows down the economic activity by reducing the level of investment. Reduced investment increases unemployment, which reduces the spending capacity of the consumers. That subsequently decreases aggregate demand. And so it looks like they got the right answer in this here. I think they maybe just picked the wrong answer choice for the explanation that they are giving. So the answer would actually be 3, raise the tax rate and decrease government spending. The tutor provided the correct rationale, but selected the wrong final answer. And to clarify, the reducing government expenditure directly reduces aggregate spending, since government expenditure poses a significant portion of AD. Meanwhile, raising taxes reduces the disposable income of consumers, which reduces consumption and overall spending in the economy. So a little bit of clarification there, but otherwise we agree with that. We're going to have to mark the solution as incorrect just because the tutor selected the wrong answer, but the explanation was the same. Okay, so let's take a look at this question. So I think these questions, I think that we're going to have several questions now coming up, and they're all going to be about private and public goods. So in the interest of clarity, I'm going to look up probably a matrix, a private public good matrix, and we're just going to have that in front of us in order to really let you guys see the way we're going to be looking at this type of question. Sorry, this is lagging a little bit. Let's just take this one. What's going on here? Come on. Let's put that on the right side. And we have our matrix, right? So this is kind of the matrix we think about when we're talking about private versus public goods and everything in between. I'll explain this really quickly. So there are two ways in which we kind of characterize goods, and that allows us to classify them into 4 categories. The first way is whether a good is rivalrous, and the second way is whether the good is excludable. So rivalrous talks about whether or not a good can be whether consumption of the good by me prevents consumption of the good by somebody else. And so something like this, a classic example is just food, right? If I eat any food, that means nobody else can eat it, right? And so food is a rivalrous good. A non-rivalrous good might be something like, well, let's take one of these examples, an online Wall Street Journal, an online newspaper. Me reading the online newspaper does not, prevent anybody else or reduce the ability of anybody else of reading that newspaper, right? And so that's going to be a non-rival good. So that's that first characterization of rivalry. And the second characterization that we look at is excludability. So non-excludable goods are goods in which you can't prevent people from from kind of consuming the good. And so a classic example of that is like fish in the sea, right? You can't really, because the sea is so large, you can't stop people from fishing if they want to. And so those fish are non-excludable. The other kind of flip side of that is an excludable good, which is something that you can prevent people from consuming. And so that might be something, again, like food. If I have food, I might say, I'm going to lock this food up in my fridge. Nobody else is allowed to eat it. I can stop you from eating my food, right? And so that's going to be an example of an excludable good. And so again, that's our two ways of looking at goods: excludable and rivalry, excludability and rivalry. And then we get into this interesting dynamic of the intersection of these two characteristics. So that gives us this matrix with excludability on the column side and rivalry on the row side. And we can look at the different matrices where these two kind of characteristics combine to figure out the four types of goods. So we'll first talk about the most common type of good, and that's going to be your private goods. And those are goods which are both rival and excludable. Goods which I can stop you from consuming, and goods where my consumption decreases someone else's consumption or prevents someone else's consumption. So private goods, because by their nature they are both rival and excludable, are going to be things that we're very used to. They're very everyday things, just regular objects are typically rival and excludable. Things like physical goods are rival and excludable, and so those are our private goods. Now let's hold rivalry constant and say, let's talk about goods which my consumption reduces your consumption, but instead of allowing them to be excludable, we suddenly change them to be non-excludable. And so this is what we start to get into the kind of mixed categories, and this is called common goods. And so common goods are goods in which you can stop people from consuming these goods, case in point, fish in the sea, but they are rivalrous. And again, we can look at this example of fish in the sea, where if someone catches a fish in the ocean, that means nobody else can catch that fish in the ocean, right? So clearly, fishing in the open sea is a rivalrous good. Fish in the sea are rivalrous goods. There's only so many. But they are non-excludable in that we can't stop people from fishing. And so this, and we'll see in later questions, probably is going to lead to a situation called the tragedy of the commons. And we'll go into that when we get there. But yes, so that's a common good. And now let's hold excludability constant and say, yes, let's still talk about excludable goods, but let's instead talk about non-rival goods instead of rival ones. And so this is going to get us into something called, they call them low congestion goods here. I actually think the another term for this is club goods, right? So let's maybe get a better matrix here. I think club goods is going to be a little bit better of a, let's do this one over here. That's not very clear. This one here is probably good. Right, so club goods are those goods which are excludable. You can stop people from consuming them, but they're non-rivalrous, that once people are consuming these goods, they're not preventing anybody else from consuming them. So one example might be cable TV. You can only access cable TV by buying a certain package from a cable TV provider, but once you get to cable TV, it doesn't cost, or you getting TV beamed to your satellite dish does not prevent anybody else from getting the TV signal beamed to their satellite dish, right? And so those club goods are pretty special in that you can prevent people from accessing them, but they don't actually cost anything to continue to spread to other people, that you give up none of the rivalry nature of that good. And finally, we have public goods. And so these are goods which are both non-rival and non-excludable. And so you can't prevent people from enjoying the benefits of these goods, and consumption of these goods does nothing to prevent other people's consumption of the good. And so a classic example of this is something like national defense. And so it's not excludable in that if someone lives in the country, they are benefited by national defense no matter what. And you can't stop somebody from not being protected by national defense resources like the military or homeland security, right? On the other hand, it's also non-rivalrous. Just because the military is protecting one person does not mean that they are reduced in their capability to protect somebody else. The effectiveness of national defense is not dependent on how many people are consuming the good, and therefore it's non-rivalrous. And so that is kind of the characteristic of a public good. And so those are our 4 types of goods. And what we really want to think about here then is, when we talk about these questions, we want to just keep in mind that there are 4 categories, and we can pick or identify the correct category based on the rivalry or excludability of the good in hand. We don't have to memorize these examples or these types of points. We just have to say, is this good rivalrous, or is this good excludable? So let's take a look at this first question now in this series of questions. The first question says, clothing is A, a private good, non-excludable and non-rival. B, a common resource, non-excludable and rival. C, a club good, excludable and non-rival. Or D, a private good, excludable and rival. And so we can see here, first of all, A and B, first of all, A is wrong, right? A private good is excludable and rival, not non-excludable, non-rival. That would be a public good, so that's not going to be the right answer. B and C are correct definitions, but again, like we said, clothing, we ask ourselves, is it rival? Yes, if I take a piece of clothing, nobody else can have that piece of clothing. And is it excludable? Yes, if I say I want to lock my closet up and nobody else can take my piece of clothing, then yeah, we can prevent people from taking that piece of clothing. And so we know that because clothing is both excludable and rival, then we would characterize it as a public good, right? And so that would be our, not a public good, a private good. And so D would be the right answer here, a private good, excludable, and rival. So let's go down and see what it's a lot of questions. Let's see which the answer choice the previous tutor wrote, and they also said D for question number 1. So we're on the right track here. Let's take a look at question number 2. Question 2 says, in the absence of any form of protection of intellectual property rights, like a patent, the knowledge created by researchers is which of the following? And it goes into the 4 categories again. And so, we ask ourselves again, is this good excludable? Can knowledge created by researchers be excludable? And the answer to that is maybe. If the researcher is very careful in terms of who they allow to kind of know what the results of the research are, then it's possible that it's going to be excludable. But most people would say that in today's day and age, that information or knowledge is pretty much free, open to the market. As soon as you tell one person, there's no incentive for that person to keep it to themselves. And so knowledge is going to be relatively considered non-excludable. And then second, rivalry is consumption of knowledge or knowing about an invention, a rivalrous good. And the answer to that is more clearly no. Right, if I know about the invention of a good, that does nothing to stop. Let me read this real quick. That does nothing to prevent somebody else from enjoying the consumption of that knowledge as well, right? Rivalry is clearly not an issue here when it comes to knowledge. And so if we take these assumptions, right, and again, this is going to be dependent on the particular way that your professor has been teaching rivalry and non-excludability, but I would fairly confidently say that knowledge created by researchers is a public good, and that it is both non-excludable and non-rival in its nature. And so we would pick answer choice A. Let's take a look at the previous tutor's answer. And so the previous tutor picked B, a common resource, non-excludable and rival. So I think there was maybe an argument for club good, but definitely not for common resource, right? There's no rivalrous nature of information, and whether or not it's non-excludable or excludable, it's up for debate. But I don't think B is definitely. I don't think B is the right answer here. So let's make that amendment. We're going to pick answer choice A. Public good information is non-rival because knowledge of information does not reduce the ability of others to consume it. Additionally, information is arguably non-excludable in that it usually ends up in the public domain where everybody has access to it. Okay, so that's going to be our explanation for number 2, and we'll keep that and move on to the next question. Question number 3 says, we saw in class that the same good can fall into different categories depending on the circumstances. And so an example of such a good would be watching a movie at the theater. If a lot of people want to watch it, the movie is a blank. If very few people want to watch it to a point where a room cannot even be filled, the movie is likely to be a blank. And so again, this question seems kind of niche. And again, we just have to go back to the 2 things that we talk about anytime we're talking about a type of categorization of a type of good. And the first question is this good excludable? And so we would say in this situation, regardless of how many people have bought a ticket to go watch a movie, because by the very nature you have to buy a ticket to get into the movie theater, we would call this an excludable good, right? So we know that it's going to be either one of our 2 types of excludable goods, either a private good or a club good. And so let's say it's going to be excludable, right? Because you have to buy a ticket to get in. Next question is this good rivalrous? And so this might be a situation in which there are 2 different conditions given by the context of the question. So the first scenario is that a lot of people want to watch a movie. What that means is that a lot of people want to get into a movie theater, a lot of people want to get this ticket, and so therefore, when you or I buy a ticket to watch this movie and we sit down in the movie theater, that is taking away a seat from somebody else who might have wanted to be there, right? Because there's high demand for this movie. And so that means that this good is rivalrous, that my consumption of this movie is preventing somebody else from enjoying this movie, right? And so we would call that situation a private good in that first context. In the second context, if very few people want to watch this good to the point, watch this movie to the point where a room can't even be filled, what that means is there's pretty low demand for this movie, and so there's plenty of tickets to go around, and that more likely means that it's going to be a club good because it's a non-rivalrous good now. I can buy a ticket to get into this movie theater and watch this movie, but because the room can't even be filled, there are plenty of tickets left for everybody else, and my consumption does not prevent somebody else from buying a ticket and getting into this movie theater. So that's what we would call a club good. And so the answer here would be answer choice C. If a lot of people want to watch this movie, the movie is a private good. And if very few people want to watch it, the movie is likely to be a club good. And so let's make sure the previous tutor picked answer choice C. And the previous tutor said C, a private good and a club good. So that's great. Let's move on to the next question. Answer question 4. Which of the following statements about the free rider problem is not true? So this is something we were talking about when it comes to goods which are not excludable, right? And so a free rider problem is essentially saying that if you can't prevent someone from if you can't prevent people from enjoying a good, then they're going to be able to get access to the good, even if they don't pay for it, even if they don't contribute to the production of that good, and it's going to lead to an overconsumption or an underproduction of that type of good, right? So that's the general idea of the free rider problem. You can think of something like asking people to voluntarily contribute funds to a public park. Some people might contribute and other people might not, but because of the free rider problem, people might choose not to contribute, but they would still enjoy access to that park because everybody else has contributed. And so they would free ride into getting access to that park without having contributed resources into producing that park. And so that's an example of the free rider problem. So let's take a look at the answers that we're going to consider true or false for. A, individuals have an incentive to free ride when the good is not excludable, so that's true. That's a very good example. B says the kind of goods for which the free rider problems arise for are common goods and public goods. So again, looking at this category of goods on the right are non-excludable goods. C says markets for goods for which there is a free rider problem are inefficient because not enough of the good is produced. That's true. And because, again, not enough of that good is produced for the amount of demand there is for it. And D, goods for which the free rider problem exists tend to be over-provided relative to what would be optimal. And so I would say that D would be the wrong answer here. It would be the right answer in that it is not true. And the reason it's not true is because these goods are most often underprovided, as answer choice C is pointing out. They're not overprovided. If anything is over, it's overconsumption, right, because of free riders. And so D is going to be the right answer here because it kind of misses that kind of specificity of the overconsumption rather than the overprovision of this type of good. So 4 is going to be D. Let's take a look at the previous answer, tutor. So the previous tutor also picked answer choice D, which is great. So let's take a look at question number 5. So question 5 says, to achieve the efficient provision of public goods, the A, market should be allowed to operate without government intervention. B, government must limit the provision of those goods. C, government must tax producers of those goods. Or D, government must either provide those goods or subsidize their production. And so one thing to note here is that when we have a public good, what we consider that is to be is a market failure, right? Because public goods are not provided to the societally optimal amount. And so this is a situation in which government intervention is welcomed and necessary. If you let the market operate without government intervention, as answer choice A would allow you to do, then public goods would be permanently underproduced because nobody has an incentive to really produce public good. You can't stop people from using your good once you've produced it, and there's also, it can be consumed in an unlimited quantity. So it's really hard, especially because of that non-excludable nature, it's really hard to monetize that type of production of goods, right? So A is not going to be the right answer. And so the question is, what can government do to achieve the efficient provision of public goods? So B, government limiting the provision of these goods would worsen the problem because our problem already is that these goods are not being produced to the right levels, right? They're underproduced. And so there's no need for government to limit. The government should actually be stimulating the production of these goods. C says government must tax producers of those goods, and that similarly limits the production even more rather than stimulating production. And so D is going to be the right answer here. The government must either step in and provide these goods, or they must subsidize the production of these goods in the private market so that private producers have some additional incentive to produce more of this public good until it reaches the socially optimal amount. And so D is going to be the right answer here, and that's the typical government reaction to public goods. D. So 5D is the answer choice the previous tutor picked as well, so we're happy with that. 6. Which of the following statements about public goods is not true? A. Because people cannot be excluded from their consumption and thus have no incentive to pay for them, public goods are underprovided by the market. That's true. B. Efficiency requires that the government provide or fund or subsidize the provision of all public goods. That's not necessarily the case, right? There are some probably scenarios where the government would rather not provide or subsidize a public good if it has more costs than benefits, and so that's not necessarily going to be the answer here. Well, let's take a look at answer choice C and D first. C says efficiency requires the government provide or fund only the public goods that create more benefits and costs to society. And I would find that probably better, a more adequate answer choice relative to answer choice B. D says, in reality, it is hard to provide public goods efficiently, and that is very true. It can be hard to tell exactly how much of a public good should be provided, what level of benefit is provided by the public good, etc. So that's going to be true as well. So B seems to be the only one that's not true. Efficiency requires that the government provide or fund or subsidize the provision of all public goods. All is just all is very over-inclusive, and so I don't think that's going to be the right answer here. C says efficiency requires the government provide or fund only the public goods that create more benefits than costs to society. So yeah, I mean, this is difficult. I would say 6 maybe answer choice B instead of C. I think it depends. These look like very specific questions by a professor. It probably depends on how the information is presented by the professor in class, but um, in terms of efficiency, it seems difficult to justify why government would spend money on a public good that provides more costs than benefits, right? And so I guess there could be equity concerns, but if from an efficiency standpoint, efficiency is talking all about cost and benefit. It's talking all about surplus, right? So B is more likely to be the answer. Let's say B is a strong contender for the correct answer rather than C, although it may depend on the professor's specific lecture notes. Efficiency usually refers to maximization of total surplus. Therefore, if certain goods have cost greater than benefits, then surplus is decreased and the good might not need to be produced. Okay, so that's question 6. Let's take a look at the next questions. Question 7 says, public goods must be provided by the government as the market on its own will fail to provide them. However, even with government provision, it is very hard to achieve efficiency. Why? A says, in reality, it is very hard, if not impossible, to accurately estimate the benefits of providing a public good, and that's true. And if we're not able to accurately estimate the benefits of providing a public good, it's hard for the government to accurately identify how much they should be subsidizing or how much of the good they should be providing. B, in reality, there can be overruns in the cost of providing a public good. Yes, it can be expensive to provide a public good. I'm not sure if that exactly prevents the government from achieving efficiency. I think that might be a cost that just needs to be incurred by the government, but we'll take a look at the other answer choices. C says government decisions about which public goods to provide can be influenced by lobbying by interest groups. This is definitely true, but does it prevent the government from achieving efficiency? I guess it does. I think this is, again, a very specific, this probably is referring to something specifically on this professor's slides. I know A is definitely true, and A is the main reason. D says all of the above, so there's a possibility that B and C are also correct. I would say that, in terms of just achieving efficiency, A is going to be the answer choice that best accomplishes that, best explains why you can't efficiently provide the good. B is talking more about the cost of providing the good, and C is talking more so about the decision of which goods to provide. But if we're assuming that the government is already providing a public good, and the question is only how much of it should we provide or subsidize, then the real barrier in your way is just A, right? Which is estimating how much of it to provide based on the benefits of providing that good. So A might be tends to be the best answer. We'll see what the previous tutor put as well. And the previous tutor also said A. In reality, it's very hard, if not possible, to accurately estimate the benefits of providing a public good. So we're just going to stick with that. Let's take a look at the next question, 8. Which of the following is not a common resource? A, congested roads. B, clean water. C, wildlife, which hunters want to hunt and others want to view. Or D, a fireworks display. Taking a quick refresher, again, common goods are non-excludable but rivalrous. And so we're looking at each of these goods and identifying whether or not they fall into that category. So A says congested roads. Non-excludable, yeah, you can't stop somebody from going onto a road or a highway most of the time unless it's a toll road. And rivalrous, does my presence on this congested road prevent somebody else's presence or decrease the ability of somebody else from enjoying this road? And so yes, I would say that is the case with congestion, because it means that by consuming this resource, the road, I'm actually contributing to congestion and making it less able to be consumed efficiently by other people who might want to do so. So congested roads do fall into a category of common goods. B says clean water. Is it non-excludable? This is a tricky one. Well, yeah, you could you could say that is non-excludable. If you think about clean water more so in terms of like being able to turn on your faucet and get clean water, then it is non-excludable in that if you provide clean water to a certain area, then everybody gets going to get clean water. Uh, is it excludable? Um, Sorry, not excludable. Is it rivalrous? Yes, it's definitely rivalrous because if I consume clean water, nobody else can consume the water that I am consuming, right? We're going to put an asterisk around this question because I think there's an argument here depending on the context in which you're talking about clean water, but we will see after taking a look at the other answer choices. C says wildlife, which hunters want to hunt and others want to view. So it is non-excludable in that you can't stop people from going out and looking at wildlife or hunting wildlife, right? Well, that's actually true. You could require a permit, but assuming no permit is required, it is non-excludable. Rivalry though for wildlife, it is definitely rivalrous, right? A hunter who hunts wildlife prevents others from viewing that wildlife, right? And so that is going to be a rivalrous good in which my consumption, hunters' consumptions of this good, is reducing the consumption by others who want to view. So we're also going to put asterisks around that. Let's take a look at D. Maybe D will be a clear answer that we can definitely pick. D is a fireworks display. So is it excludable? No, it's not excludable. If you put on a fireworks display, then you can definitely make it so that others. You definitely can't make it so that nobody else who is not, I don't know, paying for his fireworks display can enjoy it, right? Everybody, if you see a fireworks display, maybe on July 4th, you'll see people putting up fireworks displays all the time, and you're not, nobody's able to stop you from doing that, right? They can't shield you from seeing that. And is it a rivalrous good? And I would have to again say no, right? A fireworks display being viewed by me, my viewing of the fireworks display does not prevent somebody else from viewing that fireworks display, right? And so I would consider this also a non-rivalrous good. So between non-excludability and non-rivalrous, we would characterize this as a public good. And so it would not be a common resource. And I think D is a fairly a good answer for why, which one of these answer choices is not a common resource. So why don't we stick with D for this answer? So let's take a look at the previous question answer about the tutor gave, and they also picked D, a fireworks display, which is good. And let's take a look at question 9. Many species of animals must be protected by law to keep them from extinction. Why are cows not one of these endangered species, even though there is such a high demand for beef? A says cows are produced at a high rate and have adapted well to their environment. B says public policies protect cows from predators and diseases. C, cows are privately owned or private goods, whereas many endangered species are owned by no one, a common resource. And D says there's a natural ecological balance between the birth rate of cows and human consumption. And so this is a good question. It points to this distinction between the efficiency nature of the different types of goods. Private goods are by and large going to result in very efficient markets because people have an incentive to protect their private goods. They're both excludable and rival. And so anytime a good is private, there's normally an efficient amount or consumption of those goods, right? You can think about, and cows are definitely privately owned, right? These days, people own these cows on ranches. You can't own. My owning of a cow prevents you from owning the cow, and I can stop you from owning my cow by putting up a fence or saying that this is not for sale. So if you think about cattle owner, then the cattle owner actually have an incentive not to slaughter all of their cows, right? Because if they slaughter all of their cows for meat, that means they have no cows left to kind of continue to give birth to new calves and continue kind of making money off of their private goods. And so there's actually a private interest because people own these cows as private goods for a cattle owner to efficiently kind of control the population of their livestock so that there's always enough for a continuing population. And that's the reason why cows are not endangered, because of that private motivation to keep them alive. Meanwhile, for common resources, because they're not excludable, right? You can think about this is the case where a lot of animals are being poached in like Africa. Think about elephants. Nobody owns the elephants, right? They're just wild elephants, but they're non-excludable. You can't stop somebody from, I don't know, looking at, or even, if they're poaching, killing an elephant. But they are rivalrous still, right? Killing an elephant prevents somebody else from consuming that elephant as well, or from looking at that elephant in a natural setting. And so there is that common good nature for other endangered species. And so that is one of the big reasons why those species are going extinct, is because nobody can stop people from consuming these goods, and yet they're rivalrous and they're worth money. And so this is what we call the tragedy of the commons, where common goods are overconsumed because of this rivalrous but non-excludable nature of their goods. And so C is going to be the right answer here. Cows are privately owned private goods, whereas many endangered species are owned by no one. So let's take a look at number 10 for the previous tutor's answer. Or sorry, number 9. So 9C as well. Cows are privately owned, whereas many endangered species are owned by no one. Great. Let's take a look at question 10. Which of the following statements about common resources is not true? So again, we're talking about this rivalrous but non-excludable type of good. So due to the free rider problem, common resources tend to be overused. And so this is true. The free rider problem is something that happens for both common goods and public goods. B says, because there is no rivalry in the consumption of common resources, whenever one person uses a common resource, it is imposing a negative externality on others who might want to use it. So again, I don't know if it's necessarily an externality, but yes, when one person uses a common resource, it does prevent others or reduce the ability of others to use it. C says there are no private solutions to the management of common resources. That's not necessarily the case. There are situations in which there private, companies have, or private parties have come together to manage common resources without government intervention. One of these examples is a case example that I know my economics professor pointed out, which is I think the Boston fishing market, where there is a kind of a self-regulating collection of like fishermen who say how much catch everybody's allowed to bring in every day, and that's not something that is imposed by a government quota or a license or a law. It's something that is simply kind of regulated by a private party. So there are definitely private solutions to the management of common resources. That being said, I'm not sure if the professor who's teaching this particular course and wrote this question had those in mind, so we can take a look at some of the answer choices as well. And D says one of the solutions that ensures that common resources are properly managed is their privatization. And so that's definitely true. If government steps in and says, we're setting a quota or setting a license, or we set a, kind of a tradable permit situation for these common goods, then that's going to be a situation where the tragedy of the commons is reduced for common goods. So I would say that C is the one that is not true, because there are certainly some types of private solutions to the management of common resources, but we can take a look at the other tutor's answer. So 10C, there are no private solutions to the management of common resources. So yeah, we picked the same one as them, and that's good. 11 says, in our analysis of the firm's behaviors and goals, when we talk about cost, we include blank, and when we talk about profit, we mean blank. So this is, in looking at the answer choices, they're all about explicit cost, implicit cost, accounting profit, and economic profit. So let's first define these different terms. Economic profit means that you're taking into account both implicit and explicit costs. Implicit costs are ones that you can put a monetary value to and say, it cost me $5 to buy resources or $10 to hire a worker. And then your explicit costs are your costs like opportunity costs. Explicit costs are the ones you can put a monetary value to, like wages or like rent or something like that. Implicit costs are the ones that are like opportunity costs. So what did I give up to pursue this opportunity, right? What money could I be making if I did not spend time doing this opportunity and instead pivoted to another one. And so those are implicit costs. And so economic profit talks about both explicit and implicit costs. We always want to know about not just the physical, not just the tangible costs, but also the opportunity cost as well. On the other hand, we have accounting profit, which talks only about explicit costs and does not account for implicit costs, right? So the costs for accounting profit are just explicit costs, whereas the costs for economic profit are both explicit and implicit costs. And so the second question is, okay, now that we know the different definitions for these types of profit and costs, which one are we talking about in this question? And so this question says, in our analysis of the firm's behavior and goals. And I assume that our analysis refers to an economist's analysis, right? Because this is not an accounting course, this is an economist's course. And so we're going to take into account that because it's an economics course, we're talking about both explicit and implicit costs, and we're talking about economic profit rather than accounting profit. And so the correct answer here would be D. In our analysis of the firm's behavior and goals, when we talk about cost, we include explicit and implicit costs. And when we talk about profit, we mean economic profit. So that's going to be the right answer here, and we're going to see if that's what the previous tutor also put. So D is what the previous tutor also put, explicit and implicit costs and economic profit. So we're all set there. So let's move on to the next question. 12 says, one of the differences between implicit and explicit costs is that A, explicit costs must be greater than implicit costs. B, explicit costs do not require a direct monetary outlay, whereas implicit costs do. C, implicit costs do not require a direct monetary outlay, whereas explicit costs do. And D, implicit costs must be greater than explicit costs. And so we're not going to pick between A or D, which are these answer choices in which one must be greater than the other. It's possible that you have no explicit costs, but definitely have implicit costs, or the other way around. And so neither of these directions, there's no requirement that one is greater than the other one. So it's either going to be B or C. And so this goes again into just that definition between, or that distinction between explicit and implicit costs. Explicit costs are ones that we tie monetary value to, in that they cost money, or we can put a figure on it. Whereas implicit costs are more so the opportunity costs, what we give up, and we can maybe estimate values, but they are not necessarily going to require a monetary value. So it looks like C is going to be our best answer here. One of the differences between explicit and implicit costs is that implicit costs do not require a direct monetary outlay, whereas explicit costs do. So let's take a look at the previous tutor's answers for number 12. And they also picked C. Implicit costs do not require direct monetary outlay, whereas explicit costs do. Okay, let's take a look at 13. Which of the following is false? A, if accounting profit is 0, then economic profit is negative. B, economic profit takes cost. Economic profit takes cost of the opportunity cost of time and capital into account. C, economic profit is equal to accounting profit plus implicit costs. And D, economic profit is equal to accounting profit minus implicit costs. So let's break this down. And I believe that's minus. I'm going to assume that's minus. A says if accounting profit is 0, then economic profit is negative. And so that if accounting profit is 0, there are circumstances in which maybe there is no implicit costs for a certain context. And so it's possible that if accounting profit is 0, then economic profit is also 0, right? So it's not necessarily going to be negative. It would definitely not be positive, right? Economic profit is always going to be equal to or lower than accounting profit because you're taking into account additional costs, but it's not necessarily going to be negative if accounting profit is 0. So I'm not going to pick A. B says economic profit takes cost of opportunity, cost of time, and capital into account. And this is true, right? Again, we're talking about economic profit, not accounting profit. And so there is going to be that element of what could I have been doing with this time or capital if I wasn't pursuing the current opportunity and taking that into account as an implicit cost. So that is definitely going to be correct. C says economic profit is equal to accounting profit plus implicit costs. That is definitely wrong. Economic profit is equal to accounting profit minus implicit costs, right? Not plus implicit costs, because that would be the wrong direction of change. And so C seems to be a good answer so far, actually. And D says economic profit is equal to accounting profit minus implicit costs. And so that is the case. You have accounting profit, which is already total profit minus, or total revenue minus explicit costs, and you want to further reduce by implicit costs. So C is pretty clearly wrong. And so we're debating between A and C. And so I guess there can be an assumption if you always think that there's going to be implicit costs no matter what the decision is, then if accounting profit is 0, then economic profit is going to be negative then. So that's, if we consider that to be the case and that's true, then C is going to be the wrong answer here. And that's just because it's blatantly wrong. That accounting profit added to implicit costs does not equal economic profit. Let's take a look at what the previous tutor wrote. And they also wrote C, economic profit is equal to accounting profit plus implicit costs. So that's good. And so we're going to go ahead with that. 14 says, which of the following is an example of an implicit cost? 1 says, the owner of a firm foregoing an opportunity to earn a large salary working in Wall Street. 2 says, interest paid on the firm's debt. And 3 says, rent paid by the firm to lease office space. And so the answer choices are either like 2 and 3, 1 and 3, 1 only, or 3 only. Let's just take a look at these 3 options and kind of say yes or no. Is this an implicit cost? And so 1 says, foregoing an opportunity to earn a large salary working on Wall Street. And so that is an implicit cost, right? And we talk about this as an opportunity cost, and it literally says opportunity in the answer choice. And what that means is that this is what the owner of a firm could be doing if he had chosen not to own his firm and instead go and earn a large salary working on Wall Street. So he's giving up his opportunity, and that's implicit cost of his decision to go into owning his own firm. So 1 is going to definitely be an example of implicit costs. 2 says interest paid on a firm's debt. That's more monetary, and that's explicit. Accounting costs would also include interest paid, just as economic costs would. So this is going to be more of an explicit cost rather than implicit. So it's not going to be 2. And 3 says rent paid by the firm to lease office space. And again, we don't think of this as an implicit cost, right? Because this is just this is just cash outflow to pay the rent. And so that would be an explicit cost, not an implicit cost, because it is monetary. And so 1 is going to be the only one that is actually going to fulfill that definition of an implicit cost, and that's going to be the one that we would choose. So for 14, the answer choice should be C, which is 1 only. In 14, C, 1 only. And it looks like the previous tutor didn't actually get to the rest of the questions, so we can go ahead and fill in the rest of those questions right now, actually. So let's see, 15. John has decided to start his own lawn mowing business. To purchase the mowers and the trailer to transport the mowers, John withdrew $1,000 from his savings account, which was earning 3% interest, and borrowed a $2,000 additionally from the bank at an interest rate of 7%. John's annual explicit cost of capital is blank, while his implicit cost of capital is which of the following? So his implicit, okay, so explicit cost of capital. So this is a hard question to do just because it's not very clear what he is, like how much of his money is he using, right? And so we can first say that, okay, so if we assume he doesn't use any of the money, one of the explicit costs, explicit cost of capital, right? Okay, so capital in particular is just referring to the loans. Okay, so then the costs are just the interest rates, right? So the first interest rate we're talking about is the explicit cost of capital. So he takes out a loan for $2,000, and that has an interest rate of 7%, right? And so every year he has to pay back a certain amount on his loan plus an additional 7% that he didn't have to pay before. So the cost of his capital is just an interest payment that he has to make every year. So 7% of $2,000 is going to give us $140. And so that's going to be his explicit cost of capital in terms of what he has to pay in order to take out this loan every single year. So 140 is going to be the right answer there. And then his implicit cost of capital is what is the interest that he used to be earning that he is now giving up. And so that's his 3% interest on his $1,000. And so, if he didn't start this business and he kept $1,000 in his savings account and kept it earning 3% interest, then that cost, then that capital is going to would have been earning him an additional 3% times $1,000 or $30 per year. And that's $30 he no longer owes. He no longer earns because he withdrew that money from the savings account. So his explicit cost is 140, while the implicit cost would be 30. And so the correct answer here would be A. So let's write that down for the answer choice here. 15A, the explicit cost of capital is the 7% he pays on his $2,000 loan, whereas the implicit cost is the 3% interest he used to earn on his $1,000 savings deposits. Right, so that's going to be question 15. Question 16 says, Jackie decides to open her own business. In the first year, she got $50,000 in accounting profit from the business. Before she decided to open her business, she turned down job offers from 3 similar firms with annual salaries of $30,000, $40,000, and $45,000. What was Jackie's economic profit in her first year of operation? So this is again going to that distinction between economic accounting profit, and we know that the real difference is that economic profit is taking into account opportunity cost. And so opportunity cost is defined as the next best alternative to the decision that Jackie made. So if Jackie's best decision was making the $50,000 in accounting profit for her business, then the next best thing she could have done was have not, instead of opening her business, she could have taken a job at a similar firm with the highest paying salary. Right? There's no reason, if they're all similar firms, for her in terms of just money to pick the $30,000 or $40,000 job if she could have been making $45,000 job. So the $45,000 job was her best next alternative. And so that is something that Jackie has to account for when we're talking about economic profit. And so we would subtract that from $50,000. So $50,000 minus $45,000 would be $5,000, and that would be Jackie's economic profit in her first year of operation. So we can write that down. Question 16 is also a Jackie's next best alternative to opening her own business in terms of salary potential alone was to take the job paying $45,000. This $45K is an implicit cost that Jackie gave up in order to open her business. Economic profit is equal to accounting profit minus implicit costs. Therefore, Jackie's economic profit is 50K minus 45K equals to 5K. Great. Let's take a look at question 17 then. Jane was a partner at a law firm earning $223,000 per year. She left the firm to open her own practice. In the first year of business, she generated revenues of $347,000 and incurred explicit costs of $163,000. Jane's accounting profit from her first year in her own practice is which of the following? And so again, accounting profit is simply revenue minus explicit costs. In this case, it would be $347,000 for revenues and $163,000 for explicit costs. Taking the difference between that two, we would get, let's see, 100 and is that $184,000 yeah, $184,000 for her accounting profit, and that's just the difference between $347,000 and $163,000. So the answer choice here would be D. 17 says answer choice D, accounting profit is equal to total revenue minus implicit costs, which is equal to, what are the numbers again? $347,000 minus $163,000, which is equal to $184,000. That would be the correct answer there. And I think 18 builds on that stem. Yeah, so again, for question 18, after considering Jane from the previous question, her economic profit in the first year is which of the following? So it's going to be her accounting profit minus what she gave up to start her firm. So that's going to be that $223,000 she used to earn. So you want to further subtract that. And so we're going to get 18, so it's $184,000, right? 184,000 minus 223,000, so it's going to give us 39,000, negative 39,000 as her economic profit. So she actually would have been making more money at a law firm than she would have made in her own practice. And so that's going to be answer choice A again. Negative 39. We'll say economic profit is equal to accounting profit minus implicit costs is equal to 184K minus 223K is equal to negative 39. Okay, and that's going to be the right answer. So that's good. Move on to question 19. 19 says marginal revenue is defined as the increase in revenue that a firm obtains by selling one more unit of a good. Marginal cost is the increase in cost caused by making that extra unit. For a firm to maximize profits, the quantity that it should produce is the quantity for which A, the marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost, B, the difference between marginal revenue and marginal cost is maximized, C, the marginal revenue is maximized, or D, the marginal cost is maximized. And so in this situation, we're talking about the profit maximizing rule, and that rule is always going to be marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. And so we think about let's talk about, let's draw this out graphically, if I can get this to maybe turn on. Let's talk about this graphically for a second. If this is marginal revenue, right, and this is marginal cost, this is going to be your profit maximizing point, right? If we say D is equal to marginal revenue and marginal cost equals supply. This is going to be your profit maximizing point. And the reason for that is because, let's say we produce a quantity less than the profit maximizing point. And let's say Q star is a profit maximizing point. Let's say we produce to the left of Q star. What that means is that marginal revenue is greater than marginal cost. And therefore, we have no incentive to continue to produce until we reach Q star, right? Because if we're over here in marginal revenue over marginal cost, we know that producing one more unit would earn us this much more profit, right? And producing another unit would earn us this much more profit. And we continue to make profit until marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. And so any quantity produced less than Q star, there's going to be that upward pressure to produce until you reach Q star. Similarly, on the right side of Q star, if we're producing over here, we're losing money per unit, right? Marginal cost is exceeding marginal revenue. And so every unit that's being produced over here is actually losing us money. And we would actually make more money by reducing the output until it's maybe a little bit less, and you would continue to be making more money by reducing output until you reach Q star as well. And so there's these two forces which both push you to reach the profit maximizing point of Q star, where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. That's the explanation. In terms of just a definition-based question, it should just be something that you memorize, that profit maximization occurs when marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. And so that is going to be answer choice A for question 19. 19, answer choice A, profit maximizing rule maximizing rule states that profit is maximized when R equals to MC. Okay, let's look at the next, it should be 19. So the next question, question 20, I believe. In the short run, a firm incurs fixed costs, A, only if it incurs variable costs, B, only if it produces no output, C, only if it produces a positive quantity of output, or D, whether it produces output or not. And so in this case, we're distinguishing fixed costs from other types of costs like variable costs. And fixed costs are costs that you incur no matter what. And they're things like rent, or they're things like energy bills, or not, maybe not energy bills, but like rent on a building or something like that, where the costs are being incurred no matter if you use the building or not, no matter how much you produce. Whereas variable costs are those costs which are tied to the amount that you produce, right? So the best answer here is going to be answer choice D, right? A firm incurs fixed costs whether it produces output or not, because fixed costs are independent of output, right? They're costs that you incur regardless if you're producing 0 units or if you're producing 1,000,000 units, right? Those costs are always going to be there. And so that's what the definition of a fixed cost is. D, fixed costs are independent of output levels, and so that's why we picked that answer. Let's take a look at the next question, question 21. For a large firm that produces and sells automobiles, which of the following costs would be a variable cost? So again, let's refresh. A variable cost is a cost that is directly tied to the level of output that a firm is producing, right? So we're looking for that kind of relationship when we're looking at these answer choices. A says that the payment that the firm makes each year for accounting services. So that seems like something that is a fixed cost. No matter how much the firm produces, they're going to be buying accounting services no matter what, right? And I assume that the accounting services are not going to charge a prorated cost relative to how many automobiles were sold. I'm going to assume it's a flat rate. B says the cost of the steel that is used in producing automobiles. That is definitely a variable cost, right? The more automobiles you produce, the more steel you would have to buy, and so that would definitely be a variable cost that we would recognize. C says the rent that the firm pays for office space in a suburb of St. Louis. And so again, like I said before in the previous question, rent is one of those classic examples of a fixed cost in which there is no kind of relationship between how much you pay in rent versus how much you are actually producing or selling, right? So rent is independent of all that. So that is going to be not a fixed cost, not a variable cost. And D says all of the above, but we already know A and C are fixed costs, not variable costs. So it's just going to be B here, the cost of the steel that's used producing automobiles. The cost of steel is directly related to the level of output the firm decides to reach. A and C are both examples of fixed costs rather than variable costs. Okay, let's do the next question. 22. Consider a table and fill in the blanks. Okay, so it looks like this is not formatted correctly, so we'll just go ahead and skip this one. Let's just do question 23. Tom's Tent Company has total fixed costs of $300,000 per year. The firm's average variable cost is $80 when it produces 10,000 tents. At that level of output, the firm's average total cost is equal to which of the following? So we need to calculate the average total cost divided by, we need to calculate the total cost and divide it by the total number of goods being produced, because that's what ATC is calculated by, right? So we have total fixed costs already of 300,000. So total costs, right? Total costs equal to fixed costs plus variable costs. And so the total fixed cost is $300,000 per year, right? So we have 300K for total fixed costs. And then variable costs is going to be an AVC of $80 and you produce 10,000 tents. If we just multiply this out, we would get total variable cost. 80 times 10,000 would give us $800,000 dollars, right, in terms of the variable cost. So the total cost is going to be $1,100 So 1.1 million, essentially, right? And so then we want to divide that by the total output level of the firm. So ATC is equal to total cost divided by quantity produced. It's going to give us 1.1 million divided by 10,000. So you can just erase those last 4 zeros and we get 110. So 110 would be the right answer here, right? At that, hopefully this kind of process makes sense. So we're gonna take a look at this answer and write it down. Question 23 says, oh, I forgot already what letter it was. I think it was D. Yep, D. Answer choice D. Average total cost is equal to TC divided by Q. TC is equal to fixed cost plus variable cost, which is equal to 300K plus 80 times 10K equal to 1.1 million. Average total cost is equal to 1.1 million divided by 10,000 is equal to 110. So that's going to be the right answer here. We'll move on to the next question. 24. On a 100-acre farm, a farmer is able to produce 30,000 bushels of wheat when he hires 2 workers. He's able to produce 4,400 bushels of wheat when he hires 3 workers. Which of the following must be true if the farmer faces diminishing marginal product of labor? And so what we're dealing with here is this idea of diminishing marginal product of labor, which is saying that for every additional unit of labor you employ, the marginal addition of productivity to your overall production is going to be a little bit less than the previous worker. And so we know that going from 2 workers to 3 workers, his production increased from 3,000 to 4,400 bushels of wheat. So the maximum that he would be able to the marginal product of labor for that 3rd worker was 4,400 minus 3,000, so 1,400 bushels of wheat. So the 3rd worker added a capability of 1,400 additional bushels of labor for this farmer's production. And so the question is, which of the following must be true if you were considering a 4th worker, right? Because all the other options talk about hiring a 4th worker. And so the diminishing marginal product of labor tells us that you would not be able to add more than 1,400 bushels of wheat to the overall production level if you added a 4th worker. Because 1,400 is how much the 3rd worker added, and the 4th worker can only add less. And so let's take a look at what the maximum level of production of bushels of wheat the farmer could face if adding a 4th worker. So that would be 4,400 plus 1,400, or 5,800. So as long as overall production after the 4th worker is less than 5,800, then it would be possible for a 4th worker to add that much productivity while still fulfilling the law of diminishing marginal product of labor. So because all of our answer choices, 5,600, 5,400, and 5,200, are less than 5,800, which is our maximum total additional bushels of wheat, then any of the above should be correct, and that should be answer choice D. And that's because it's possible that that marginal product of labor is decreasing, if we produce at any of these levels of output. So let's go to the answer key, and we'll say D. The 3rd worker's marginal product of labor was 4,400 minus 3,000 equal to 1,400 bushels. This means the 4th worker must have a marginal product of labor less than 1,400, resulting in a total bushel count of less than 4,400 plus 1,400 equal to 5,800. All 3 answer choices have outputs less than 5,800 bushels, therefore they are all possible. And that would be our final answer here. Great. So let's take a look at question 25. Marginal cost might be decreasing for small firms, those producing small quantities, because A, increasing the size of a small firm allows workers to specialize. B, marginal cost is the same as average fixed cost per unit sold in a larger size means more units over which to spread the fixed costs. C, small firms are more efficient. And D, marginal costs can never decrease. So this is, if we look at marginal cost curves, they're typically going to look something, especially for the firm, right? They're going to look something like this. Let me see if I can, yeah, okay. They're going to look something like this. They're going to be like, right? So kind of like a check mark almost. So it's going to decrease for this first initial level of quantity supplied, and then go up as quantity supply continues to increase. So the reason that there's this initial dip for small firms producing small quantities is because of something known as increasing scales of return, right? Scales of economy. And so what that means is that actually in the beginning, when you first start production of a good, there are so many resources to go around that you're able to employ all those resources at maximum efficiency, and additional production is actually going to cause your overall cost to be lower. However, as you continue to produce output, those costs become a little bit higher over time, because there's going to be less efficiency, people are not going to be able to produce as much, and so there's going to be additional costs that are incurred as output is increasing, and you get to diseconomies of scale. So this is not the best phrasing of the question, I think, because increasing the size of a small firm and allowing workers to specialize, while this may be true, we're not sure if this is if producing more requires an increase in the size of a small firm. It may or may not. For B, marginal cost is the same as average fixed cost per unit sold. That's not true, so we can scratch out B already. C says small firms are more efficient, and this is true because there's typically less crowding, there's typically less wasteful resource management, but it's not always the case. And D says marginal cost can never decrease, but we know that that's not the case in the beginning of the marginal cost at low output levels. So it's either going to be A or C. Yeah, see, I think C is going to be a little bit better of an answer choice, just because A, technically, if you increase output to very high quantities, you are increasing the size of a small firm, and you do allow workers to specialize, but marginal cost still goes up. And so it should be more so the case that small firms are more efficient, and that's why marginal cost could be decreasing, because they are simply able to employ resources at those small quantities at a much more efficient level than larger firms who are producing at higher output levels. So I want to say C, although the question is not very clearly answered. Small firms are able to fully employ their scarce resources in the lower levels of production, resulting in a decreasing marginal cost curve for a small period of time. So that would be my best guess for that question. Well, that's not a very straightforward question. 26. As a quantity produced by a firm increases, marginal cost eventually starts increasing because of A, diminishing or decreasing marginal product of labor. B, in the short run, a firm cannot add workers. C, each additional unit is cheaper to produce. And D, marginal cost can never increase. And so A is most likely going to be the right answer here. B, in the short run, the firm cannot add workers. That may be the case, but that just simply means it would take the firm a longer amount of time to get to a portion of the marginal cost curve where you have this high cost. So that's not necessarily saying why marginal cost is increasing. It just talks about how long it would take it to get to that point. C says that each additional unit is cheaper to produce, but obviously that's not the case because marginal cost is increasing rather than decreasing. So each additional unit is getting more expensive to produce. D says marginal cost can never increase, and that's not the case. Marginal cost is increasing for most of the curve. So A is going to be our best answer here. And again, diminishing or decreasing marginal product of labor just tells us that when we employ more and more employees or laborers, each person is adding less and less to overall productivity, but we have to pay those laborers the same amount of money, right? Because you don't pay people differently. And so that decrease in marginal product of labor makes it so that the costs of employment drive up the overall marginal cost of additional units of production. So we're going to say the answer choice here is A. Decreasing marginal product of labor ensures that costs begin to go up as output fails to keep up with the additional costs of hiring more labor. 27 is next. Take a look. 27 says, diminishing or decreasing marginal product of labor is more likely to appear when the firm is blank. The cause for diminishing marginal product of labor is that blank. A says small, as more workers are hired. The crowding out of labor due to fixed land capital has a larger impact than the gains from specialization. B says small, as more workers are hired. Crowding of labor due to fixed land capital has a smaller impact than the gains from specialization. C says large, and it's large impact than the gains from specialization. And D says large, and a smaller impact than the gains from specialization. So first thing we can do here is saying, does diminishing marginal product of labor occur more when the firm is small or large? The answer is large, and that's just because of crowding out, right? You can think of employing 10 people in a very small room. At the end of the day, if you add that to 20 people or 30 people, there's not going to be enough resources or space to go around, and the productivity overall is going to go decrease. And so a large firm is going to be the setting in which that decrease in marginal product of labor is more likely to occur. So it's not going to be A or B. We're picking between C and D. And then the question is the crowding of labor due to fixed land or capital a larger impact than the gains from specialization, or a smaller impact? And if there's diminishing marginal product of labor, then we know that the crowding out effect has to be larger than the gains from specialization, right? Because if the crowding out effect was smaller than the gains from specialization, then we would see that marginal product of labor would be going up, right? There might be some loss of productivity due to crowding out, but there would be even greater gains from specialization. The fact that marginal product of labor is decreasing or diminishing is going to tell us that there has to be a larger impact from crowding out, and that is erasing all of the progress made from specialization and further diminishing marginal product. So it's going to be C, most likely to appear when the firm is large, and the cause for diminishing marginal product of labor is that the crowding, as more workers are hired, the crowding out of labor due to fixed land or capital has a larger impact than the gains from specialization. Larger firms are more likely to suffer from the crowding out effect, and if marginal product is going down, then the crowding out effect must exceed the gains from specialization. And that's going to be our answer there. So let's go to the next question, 28. When the marginal cost exceeds average total cost, A, average fixed cost must be rising, B, average total cost must be rising, C, average total cost must be falling, and D, marginal cost must be falling. So here is one of those things that we have to keep in mind when we're talking about cost curves. Average total cost might look like something like this, and then marginal cost is going to look something like this, right? And the key point to note in terms of the relationship between marginal cost and average total cost is that marginal cost intersects average total cost at the minimum of average total cost, right? And so, and that makes sense. Marginal cost is the big, average total cost is simply an average of marginal cost added all together plus the fixed cost, right? So if at this point in time, on the left side of this intersection at the minimum of ATC, marginal cost is lower than average total cost, and therefore marginal cost is dragging down the average, right? And that's why we have this decreasing portion of the average total cost curve. And then as soon as marginal cost intersects average total cost, it begins to exceed average total cost, right? It's going up at a faster rate than average total cost is, and that rate of increase is going to drag up the average, right? you add more data points which are higher than the average is going to go up as well. And so because of this nature of intersection of the minimum, whenever the marginal cost exceeds average total cost, you know that average total cost must be rising. And so that is going to be answer choice B right here. When the marginal cost exceeds average total cost must be rising. Marginal cost intersects average total cost at ATC's minimum. As a result, when marginal cost exceeds ATC, we know that MEMC is pulling the average up and ATC is rising. Okay, so that's 28. Move on to 29, almost there. 29 says the Big Blue Sky Jet Company has long-run total cost of $20 million if it produces 5 jets, and long-run total cost of $24 million if it produces 6 jets. The Big Blue Sky Jet Company is experiencing A, economies of scale, B, constant returns to scale, C, diseconomies of scale, or D, negative profits. So this looks like a question that's testing our knowledge of economies of scale. And so the explanation for economies of scale is economies of scale refers to that when you ramp up production at a certain level, you're actually going to have decreasing average total costs. And that's because you're being more efficient in producing by adding more production. Cost return to scale is saying that your average total cost is staying the same as you ramp up production. And diseconomies of scale is saying that you're actually increasing your costs as you ramp up production. And negative profits just means you're losing money. So looking at this, the average total cost for the 5 jets that the Big Blue Sky Jet Company was initially producing was 20 divided by 5, so $4 million each, right? And then the average long run total cost after producing 6 jets is $24 million divided by 6, so still $4 million each. And so what we're seeing here is that the average cost of each jet is averaging around $4 million at all levels of production, and therefore by ramping up production and keeping costs the same, the Big Blue Sky Jet Company is experiencing constant returns to scale. So we're going to make a note of that and write that answer choice. 29 says B, the average total cost of the 5 jets is $4 million. The average total cost of the 6 jets is also $4 million. As a result, the company is experiencing constant returns. Constant returns to scale. Let's look at the next question, 30. Question 30 says, consider the figure below the 3 average total cost curves in the diagram. So we don't have a figure, so we're going to skip this one. Figure question 32, 31, and 32 also both refer to a figure, so we can't answer those. Make a note. Wait. Yeah, 30 to 32. And so that's going to be wrapping up our answer choice for this very, very long list of questions that this student inputted. And so hopefully all of those explanations made sense. We covered some stuff about public good, private good. We covered some stuff about implicit versus economic costs, which is, implicit versus explicit costs and accounting versus economic profit. And we also talked a little bit about cost curves and marginal costs and marginal product of labor. So hopefully that was all helpful to you guys. We're going to mark this solution as incorrect just because there was these 2 here that we had problems with, and we also added a bunch of answers for the questions that the previous tutor didn't answer. So just want to make sure that's amended correctly. Adding all that in. And other than that, let's see if we still have any more questions left. I don't believe we do, so that'll wrap up what we have for today. And hopefully that was helpful, guys. We're going to be doing this again next week. Feel free to join then. And otherwise, hope everybody's staying safe and take care and have a good rest of the day.